After the War of 1812, there was an enormous mood of nationalism. Uh, what do we mean by that? Well, national pride, first of all. The nation had survived the War of 1812. It hadn't really been a victory, but to a lot of people it felt like a victory because they had survived again against the most powerful military in the world. And they had secured the American Revolution. Their independence was much more secure now. Um, and in this spirit, they were much more willing, many people were, to give more power to the federal government. Now, nationalism takes different forms. There's economic nationalism, for example, or judicial nationalism. Um, let's begin with economic nationalism. One of the moves that fits into this category is the chartering of the Second Bank of the United States. The first bank had been chartered in 1791 under the encouragement of Alexander Hamilton. But it lasted for 20 years. Its charter was for 20 years, and it expired in 1811. And it took 5 years to agree on this. But after the war, Congress agreed that another Bank of the United States would be created. It regulated the currency. It lent money, made loans to people to build or expand businesses. It controlled the state banks. It put more organization into the nation's economy. Um, the tariff of 1816 was also in this vein. Uh, Earlier, the tariffs had been revenue tariffs mostly. In other words, their purpose was to raise money for the federal government. Now, this was a higher tariff that could have been called a protective tariff. That means the idea is not to raise money from goods that are coming into the country. It's to make the prices of foreign goods high enough so that not so many will come into the country. So this doesn't raise as much money for the federal government, but it does protect American industries, manufacturers, for example, who are now free of a lot of foreign competition. Also, we see nationalism in internal improvements. Now, this means things like roads, canals, bridges, even colleges that are paid for by the federal government. Now, President Madison vetoed this bill. He said Congress lacked that power to do those things under the Constitution. But the internal improvements continued nonetheless with private money. And later on in American history, there would be presidents and Congresses who would support federal money for internal improvements. Uh, this approach that we've been discussing fits perfectly the beliefs of Henry Clay. Uh, Later on, he would be a leader of the Whig Party. The Whig Party hasn't yet developed in the years following the War of 1812, but some of the ideas are starting to come together. For example, Clay favored a national bank, protective tariffs, internal improvements, all the things that we've been talking about, and he calls this the American system. That's his term for it. He wanted, once again, an active federal government which used its power to develop the economy. Think about who he draws his inspiration from. He is a continuation of the basic philosophy of Alexander Hamilton, who also wanted a federal government which would actively promote the economy. And that tradition, from Hamilton to Clay to other people later in American history, has continued. For example, Franklin Roosevelt favored an active federal government which would promote the economy, and others have as well. Um, Another category of nationalism is what we could call judicial nationalism. And this was led by the Chief Justice, John Marshall. He was a Federalist. He was appointed by President John Adams in the last portion of the Adams administration, and he served as Chief Justice for about 35 years until his death in 1835. There are three cases here that we can highlight that will illustrate how John Marshall believed in a strong federal government, and he strengthened the power of the Supreme Court. The first one is Martin versus Hunter's lessee of 1816. And what we need to know about that is that the federal courts can overrule state courts if they deal with federal laws. If the state courts are trying to interpret federal laws, then Marshall said, well, the federal courts, up to the Supreme Court, have the highest authority over this. They have the final say. Now, in the second of these three cases, McCulloch versus Maryland, 1819, the issue of whether the federal government could create a national bank was challenged. For example, the state of Maryland tried to tax a national bank and limit its power. The Marshall Court, the Supreme Court led by John Marshall, cited the necessary and proper clause. He said there are a number of things that are powers that are given to Congress under the Constitution, such as the power to regulate trade or commerce. He said that the federal government can do the things that are necessary and proper for activities like regulating trade. And that would include creating a national bank. This is the Supreme Court giving an answer to the question which certainly existed in the 1790s in the disagreements between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Also, the Marshall Court said that states cannot tax federal institutions. States can't place taxes on the federal government. Why? Because he has a very famous quotation here. He says, the power to tax is the power to destroy. So if they were free to tax the federal government, then they would have the power to destroy it, and they don't have that power. The third of these cases is Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824. The state of New York tried to regulate a ferry business across the Hudson River between New York and New Jersey. But again, the Marshall Court ruled that states could not regulate businesses that travel between states, that involve more than one state. And once again, this firms up the federal government's control over interstate commerce or trade between states. Now, nationalism also shows up in foreign policy. The Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819 resulted in Florida coming into the United States. There's interesting background on this. Native Americans, such as the Seminole and Creek Indians, would often escape to Spanish Florida to get outside the reach of the American military, American law. Andrew Jackson actually invaded Florida. He was a general who invaded Florida and attacked them. Now, the Spanish protested strongly against this because Florida at the time was Spanish territory. But Spain was weak. They had trouble administering their very large empire. These events pressured Spain to cut a deal with the United States to agree to a treaty called the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819, so that for $5 million, the United States obtained Florida from Spain. The Adams here is John Quincy Adams. He's the son of President John Adams, and he is James Monroe's Secretary of State, and was very, very influential. And then later, in 1824, he would be elected president. The treaty also defined the western boundary of the Louisiana Purchase, which ran up against Spanish territory farther west in North America. This is the treaty here. You see this area right here. This is East Florida and West Florida. All of that becomes American territory, and the west boundary of the Louisiana Purchase is defined here in this new boundary line. Now, there was another diplomatic achievement during Monroe's presidency, and that was called the Anglo-American Convention with England. It extended the U.S.-Canadian border along the 49th parallel to the Rocky Mountains, and then eventually it would go all the way out to the Pacific coast. It's easier to show that on a map. Originally, this was British territory in blue here. In green, this was American territory, and the United States and Britain agreed on a treaty to extend this border through the lands of the Louisiana Purchase, and then later another treaty with Britain extended it all the way to the west coast. Now, I would encourage you to keep coming back to this map because it will be helpful frequently. Another area of nationalism and foreign policy is the Monroe Doctrine. Again, John Quincy Adams was the brains behind it, Monroe's Secretary of State. It had 4 provisions. It said, first of all, the U.S. would stay clear of Europe. We're not interested in getting involved in European affairs. And the United States would accept existing colonies and nations in the Western Hemisphere. So these would be colonies or nations controlled by European countries. But we would not allow more colonization anywhere in the Western Hemisphere by European countries. And any European intervention or action in the Western Hemisphere we would view as hostile. Now, we didn't have a lot of power to enforce this. It didn't make a big splash in Europe, but it does lay down a principle which would become important later in American history, and it does show, again, that spirit of nationalism.